I've been a truck driver for over 15 years, so I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing compares to what happened that particular night, about 2 years ago. It was one of those late-night trips I usually try to avoid, but the pay was good, and the delivery had to be completed before sunrise. The route was a lonely stretch of highway through the middle of nowhere, the kind where you can drive for hours without passing another soul. I've always liked the quiet of the open road, but that night the silence felt different, heavy, like the air itself was watching me. It all started around 2 a.m. The sky was pitch black, and the only light came from my truck's headlights. I was listening to an old playlist to keep myself awake when I spotted something in the distance blocking the road. It was a car, parked in the middle of the highway with its hazard lights flashing. I slowed down carefully because, well, you never know what you'll find out here. It could be someone in need of help or, at worst, some kind of trap. But something in me said I needed to stop. It didn't feel right to just drive past. The car was an old sedan, dark blue and beaten up, like it had seen better days. It was parked squarely in the middle of the lane, leaving no way to pass without going off the road. I stepped out of the truck with my flashlight, my hand shaking a bit, and approached the car. The first thing I noticed was that the driver's door was open, but there was no one inside. The strange part was the scratches, deep ones running along the sides, like claws had scraped the paint. Inside the passenger seat, there was a bag turned upside down, papers scattered everywhere. And the smell, metallic and sickening, like blood. I walked around the car, shining my flashlight, but there was nothing else. No footprints, no signs of anyone nearby. The road was dead quiet. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it all, when I heard it. A noise coming from the trees on the left side of the road. It was low, almost like a groan, or maybe a sigh. My body froze. You know that feeling when you just know someone's watching you? That's exactly what I felt. My gut told me to get back to the truck, so I did. I climbed back into the cab, locking the door with shaky hands, keeping my eyes on the side mirror, waiting for I don't even know what. But nothing came out of the woods. As soon as I shut the truck's door, my mind was racing. Part of me wanted to call the police, but honestly, I had no idea how to explain what I'd just seen. Hi, there's an abandoned car in the middle of the road with strange marks and a bad smell. But no one around? They'd think I was crazy. I decided it was best to just keep driving and report it once I got to a town or gas station. But as I buckled my seatbelt and started the engine, something made my stomach drop. The car's hazard lights suddenly turned off. No flicker, no fade, just total darkness, like someone had switched them off. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the battery died. Still, I pressed harder on the gas, my eyes glued to the mirrors. The road behind me was pitch black and empty, but I couldn't shake the heavy feeling in my chest. Something wasn't right. The playlist I had going wasn't helping anymore. I turned it off, leaving just the hum of the engine and the sound of the tires on the asphalt. It wasn't much comfort. It didn't take long for me to notice it. At first, it was just a faint glint, like light reflecting off something behind me. It was quick, barely noticeable. Then it happened again, this time longer. It looked like headlights coming up, but that's when I realized there were no headlights. Whoever, or whatever, was back there was driving with their lights off. My heart started racing. It didn't make sense. On a road this dark, no one would drive without headlights unless they didn't want to be seen. I kept speeding up, but a truck is heavy and it's not like I could just outrun anything. The vehicle behind me got closer, staying at a steady distance as if it wanted me to know it was there. I started sweating, my hands slipping on the wheel. When I glanced in the rearview mirror again, I could make out the outline of a car, a sedan maybe. But what scared me the most was how it was perfectly centered in the lane, mimicking the exact position of the abandoned car I'd seen earlier. That's when I knew. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone or something was following me. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but every fiber of my being told me otherwise. Whoever was behind me wasn't trying to pass or leave me alone. It felt like a predator playing with its prey. I started thinking about all the stories I'd heard of truckers being followed or even attacked, and stopping to ask for help wasn't an option. There wasn't a gas station or a town for at least 30 miles. My only choice was to keep driving and hope for the best. Then suddenly, the lights behind me disappeared. The car was just gone. For a brief moment, I felt relieved, but it didn't last. My gut told me this was worse. A vehicle doesn't just vanish. I eased off the gas and stayed alert, eyes glued to the mirrors, waiting to catch any movement. And then the engine started to sputter. It wasn't normal. The truck had been serviced recently, and I'd never had issues with it before. Yet, here I was, feeling the cab shudder as the engine stuttered like it was being forced to stop. I pulled over to the shoulder because, at that point, I was scared the truck would die right in the middle of the road. As soon as I shut the engine off, darkness swallowed everything. I looked around, checking the mirrors, but the road was empty again. Just the sound of wind rustling through the trees around me broke the silence. That eerie sensation of being watched came back with a vengeance. I grabbed my flashlight again, but my hand was shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. I swept the beam across the area, but there was nothing, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. And then I heard it. A metallic scraping sound, like something sharp dragging across metal. It was coming from behind the truck. My blood ran cold. Whoever or whatever it was, they were close. I tried to remember if I had locked the cab doors when I got out, and just the thought that I might not have made my chest tighten. I reached behind the seat for the tire iron I always carried, but honestly, I knew it wouldn't do much good. I crept around the back of the truck, shining the flashlight as I went, and that's when I saw them. Deep scratches on the rear bumper. The same claw-like marks I'd seen on the abandoned car. The scratches were deep, like something with sharp claws had dragged them across the metal. I could barely breathe as I ran my fingers over them, feeling the cold, jagged edges. It didn't make sense. The road had been completely empty. No one could have gotten that close without me noticing. I rushed back into the cab, locking the doors the second I got inside. My hands were trembling as I started the engine. I told myself I needed to get moving, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever had left those marks. But as I was about to shift into gear, I froze. In the rearview mirror, I saw something moving. It wasn't a car, and it definitely wasn't human. It was tall and thin, with jerky, unnatural movements, like its limbs didn't bend the way they were supposed to. It was standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at the truck. I couldn't see a face, but I could feel it watching me. It was one of those moments where your body locks up, and no matter how much you want to scream or run, you just can't. I sat there, paralyzed, as it took a single, deliberate step toward me. When I finally snapped out of it, I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching as I sped down the road. I glanced in the side mirror, and my stomach sank. The thing was running after me. It was fast, way too fast for something that moved so unnaturally. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they started to hurt, and I found myself praying under my breath, begging for the road to end, for some sign of life, some kind of escape from this nightmare. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a small gas station on the side of the road. The sign was flickering, barely holding on, but to me, it was like a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. I pulled in and parked the truck in the first spot I saw, killing the engine and scanning the road behind me. Nothing. The road was empty again, as if nothing had happened. I climbed out of the truck and rushed into the convenience store, where the cashier, a skinny guy with a baseball cap, looked at me like I'd just seen a ghost. And honestly, I probably looked like I had. While I tried to catch my breath, the cashier asked if I was okay. My voice was shaky, barely more than a whisper, as I explained the basics. An abandoned car, strange marks, something in the road. He gave me a look like he understood more than I was saying. "You stopped? At the car?" he asked, his tone suddenly serious. I nodded, and he let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. "Man, you shouldn't have stopped. I've heard stories about that stretch of highway. Weird stuff happens out there. People disappearing. Things no one can explain." That only made me more anxious. I pressed him for more details, but he avoided eye contact, like he didn't want to talk about it. He just said one thing before dropping the subject. "Whatever you saw, you're lucky you made it here." A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed a coffee, hoping it would help me calm down, and glanced out the window toward the road. It was still empty, but far off in the distance, just beyond where the lights reached, I thought I saw movement. Something quick, almost imperceptible. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. After about 20 minutes, I decided it was time to get back on the road. The cashier wished me luck, but the way he said it felt more like a warning. I climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and got moving again. For a while, everything seemed normal. The road was quiet, and I started convincing myself that I'd left all the weirdness behind. But then I glanced in the rearview mirror and my chest tightened. There it was again. The same dark blue sedan. No headlights, just a shadowy outline creeping up behind me. It was following me. Again. I've never driven so fast in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my destination, nearly 60 miles later. When I finally parked and delivered the load, I slumped into the seat, completely drained. I never saw the car or that figure again, but to this day, I avoid that highway at all costs. And every time I see a car broken down on the side of the road, I just keep driving. I don't know what I ran into that night, but I'm sure it wasn't anything from this world. Some things you don't understand. You just learn to stay away from them. I've never been one to believe in those road stories that older truckers love to share. I always thought they were just ways to pass the time or scare rookies like me. My name is Sarah. I'm 27, and I started driving long-haul trucks just a few months ago. Before that, I worked local delivery routes, but the idea of the open road always appealed to me. This story happened during my first solo trip on a major route, hauling industrial equipment from Denver to Seattle. It was early October, the time when fallen leaves start covering the roads in the mountains, but also when the weather can change in an instant. I was nervous, but excited, determined to prove to myself that I could handle anything. Little did I know what awaited me that night. The route passed through the Cascade Range, and there were plenty of warning signs about dangerous conditions like ice and fog. I'd been driving all day and planned to stop before tackling the trickiest part of the mountain pass. Night fell quickly, as it does in the mountains, and the darkness was so thick it seemed to swallow my truck's headlights. The steady hum of the engine was almost comforting, but then the static from my CB radio started getting on my nerves. I had adjusted it before setting out, but it seemed to have a mind of its own. Until that point, I had only heard faint static and the occasional chatter from truckers far away, but then a voice suddenly broke through the silence. It was a man, and he sounded desperate. "Can anyone hear me? I'm coming down the mountain, and my brakes are gone. I can't stop." His voice was full of panic, and I grabbed the mic immediately to respond. "This is Sarah, I can hear you." "Where are you? How can I help?" His reply came quickly, but it was distorted with static, making it hard to understand. From what I could gather, he was near a sharp curve a few miles ahead. My heart raced. I knew that stretch of road was dangerous, and a truck coming downhill without brakes was a recipe for disaster. "Hang on, I'm on my way," I said, not entirely sure what I could do. The road felt darker, more menacing, as I drove slowly, straining my eyes to catch a glimpse of anything ahead. Despite the urgency in his voice, there were no brake lights or engine noise to indicate another truck. The only sound was the muted hum of my tires on the wet pavement. I tried calling him again on the radio, but there was only static. Just as I was starting to wonder if I'd misheard or if the signal had come from farther away than it seemed, I rounded a sharp curve and froze. There it was, a semi-truck, parked across the road, completely blocking the way. I slammed on the brakes, the screech echoing through the mountains, and my heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. The truck ahead of me was a semi, large like mine, completely blocking the road. Its headlights were off, but the hazard lights blinked slowly, as if it had been left there not long ago. What unsettled me the most was that the engine was still warm. I could see faint steam rising in the cold night air. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of my cab, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Hello, is anyone there?" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the rocky mountain walls. No answer, only the sound of the wind and, in the distance, the rustle of trees. I approached the truck's cab, its door slightly ajar, swaying gently with the wind. Peering inside, I noticed the CB radio was on, the green light glowing faintly. The floor of the cab was littered with a thermos, an old jacket, and a baseball cap, all scattered like someone had left in a hurry. Everything pointed to the driver having exited the truck abruptly. But to where? I swept my flashlight around the area, illuminating the road and the bushes along the sides, but there were no footprints in the damp ground. It was as if the driver had vanished into thin air. I returned to my truck, my heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. The road was completely blocked, and there was no way I could get around without someone moving that truck. I grabbed the mic and called out again. "This is Sarah. Can anyone hear me? There's a truck blocking the road, and I need help." I waited a few moments, but the only response was that maddening static. My mind began racing. Could the driver of the abandoned truck be the same man who called for help? If so, where was he now? And why wasn't he responding if his CB radio was still on? I decided to call emergency services, but as I waited on hold, an eerie sensation washed over me. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest, and the silence became deafening. Only the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees broke the stillness. When I finally got through to someone, I explained the situation, and they promised to send help. They said it would take at least an hour. I had no choice but to sit there, alone, in the dark, with that strange, empty truck in front of me. As I waited, the air seemed to grow heavier. It wasn't just the darkness or the cold. There was something about that place that felt oppressive, like it was watching me. I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement, but the road behind me was as empty as the road ahead. My flashlight beam still pointed toward the semi-truck, but now it seemed even more sinister, almost like it was daring me to come closer. For a brief moment, I thought about trying to edge my truck along the shoulder of the road to get around it, but the steep drop-offs and loose rocks made it impossible. I was trapped. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were deliberate, slow, and coming from the direction of the parked semi. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my flashlight again, my hands trembling so much that the beam of light wavered. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me from the shadows. Suddenly, the CB radio in my truck crackled to life again. This time, the voice was closer, louder. "Help me!" It was the same man from before, but his voice sounded weaker now, almost like he was struggling to speak. "Where are you?" "I see your truck," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But there was no response, just static. My stomach churned as I tried to piece it all together. How could he be asking for help when the truck was empty? And if he needed help, why wasn't he responding? I couldn't just sit there anymore. Against every instinct telling me to stay inside, I climbed out of my truck again, flashlight in hand, and started toward the semi-truck. Each step felt like it took twice the effort, and the cold air burned my lungs as I breathed. When I got closer, something caught my eye that I hadn't noticed before. Deep scratches along the side of the cab, as though someone, or something, had clawed at the metal. What made it worse was that the marks looked fresh, the edges still sharp and clean. I moved closer to the truck's cab, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The scratches on the side were deep and jagged, like something sharp had dragged across the metal with force. The cab door was still open, swaying gently in the breeze, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step I took. Peering inside one last time, I noticed something else I hadn't seen before. Dark stains on the floor of the cab. It looked like a mix of dirt and blood? I couldn't be sure in the dim light, but the sight made my stomach twist. My gut screamed at me to get back in my truck, but something about this scene wouldn't let me walk away. Just as I was about to back away, my CB radio blared again, making me jump. This time the voice was clearer but more chilling. "You shouldn't be here," it said, almost like a warning. My heart raced as I dropped my flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the ground and briefly illuminating the truck's side. That's when I saw them. Handprints smeared along the metal, as though someone had dragged themselves out of the cab. The realization hit me like a punch. Someone had been here, but there were no footprints to show where they'd gone. I grabbed the flashlight, backing away toward my truck, my entire body trembling. As I climbed into the cab, I locked the doors and tried to steady my breathing. The CB radio continued to crackle, but now it wasn't just one voice. There were whispers, multiple voices, faint but overlapping like a broken chorus. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent chills down my spine. Then, out of nowhere, the headlights on the semi-truck flickered on, cutting through the darkness. The truck shifted, rocking back and forth as if the engine was trying to start itself, but there was no one in the driver's seat. I turned the key in my ignition, desperate to start my truck and get out of there. At first, the engine refused to turn over, the empty click of the starter echoing in the cab. Panic rose in my chest as I tried again and again, until finally the engine roared to life. I slammed the gear into reverse and backed away as fast as I could, my eyes locked on the semi-truck ahead. Its headlights continued to flicker and the rocking grew more violent, but I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I didn't even look in my mirrors. I just drove. After a few minutes of heading back the way I came, I saw flashing lights in the distance. It was the emergency crew I'd called earlier. Pulling over, I jumped out of my truck, nearly in tears, and explained everything to them. They promised to check it out and asked me to wait while they investigated. But when they returned, their faces told me everything. "There's no truck," one of them said. "The road is clear." I tried to argue, to insist they must have missed it, but they were firm. There was nothing there. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I've never driven that route again, and my CB radio, I haven't touched it since. Every time I hear static, it brings me right back to that mountain pass and the truck that shouldn't have been there. I never used to believe in those road stories, you know? I always thought they were just tales to scare truck drivers. But after what happened that night, I started to understand why some stories stick around. It was a Wednesday, early June, and I was driving down a highway in the middle of nowhere. I had retired from the police about 3 years earlier, and driving trucks was my way of keeping my mind busy. It was almost midnight, and a heavy storm was rolling in. Lightning lit up the road, and I was focused on getting to the next gas station, which I knew was about 20 minutes away. The solitude of the road never bothered me, but that night felt heavy. There was this strange kind of silence between the thunderclaps. That's when I saw him. A figure on the shoulder of the road, drenched, waving for a ride. A hitchhiker in the middle of a storm. My first instinct was to keep driving. Ex-cop instinct. Never pick up strangers. But something about him made me hesitate. He was wearing a dark, soaked jacket with an old backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked exhausted, shivering. I thought he might freeze out there if no one stopped. I sighed, annoyed at myself, and slowed down. I rolled down the window just enough to talk. "Where are you headed?" I asked. He answered quickly, but his voice was so hoarse I could barely hear. "Next town. Just the next town." Something in the way he said it made me suspicious, but I unlocked the door anyway. He climbed in without saying much, just muttered a quiet thanks while clutching the backpack to his chest. The smell of wet clothes and a faint metallic scent, maybe blood, filled the cabin. He had sunken, restless eyes and a hastily wrapped bandage around his left hand. I tried making small talk to ease the tension. I asked his name, but he dodged the question. "Zach," he said after a pause. "Just Zach." I asked where he was coming from, and his answer was vague. "Oh, far away." That wasn't an answer, but I decided not to press. Every time I asked something simple, he deflected, like he didn't want to give too much away. As I drove, I kept glancing at him from the corner of my eye. He looked lost. But there was something off about him. His backpack seemed way too heavy for someone just heading to the next town. And that bandage on his hand? It was sloppy, like it had been thrown on in a rush, and there was blood seeping through. He noticed me looking and quickly moved his hand out of sight, looking uneasy. To break the tension, I turned on the radio, but all I got was static. Great, I thought. Just the kind of night I'm having. He kept staring out the window, but it was like he wasn't even seeing the storm. He was too quiet, almost unnervingly so. The rain was getting heavier, and the road felt more isolated by the minute. As I drove, I couldn't shake the weird feeling in the air. Zach didn't make a sound. He just kept fidgeting with his backpack like he was nervous. I asked again, "Are you okay? That hand of yours, the cut looks bad." He hesitated, glanced at me briefly, and replied curtly, "It's fine." But it clearly wasn't fine. He was sweating, even though it was cold, and he started gripping the backpack tighter. My mind was racing with possibilities. Fugitive? Someone running from an accident? Or just a guy down on his luck? It was impossible to tell, and his silence only made everything feel stranger. About 15 minutes later, I spotted the gas station I'd been expecting. I told him, "I'm stopping to refuel and grab some coffee. Do you need anything?" He just shook his head without looking at me. I pulled up next to the pump, turned off the engine, and took one last glance at him before stepping out. He looked uncomfortable but didn't move. I grabbed my wallet and said, "Be right back." The rain was pounding on the roof of the station as I ran inside the convenience store. Once inside, I grabbed a cup of hot coffee, trying to shake off the uneasiness. A part of me didn't even want to go back to the truck. When I returned, things felt wrong. The truck's cabin was empty. There was no sign of him. The backpack, the soaked jacket, everything was gone. My first instinct was to look around, but there was no one on the road or at the gas station. It was like he had vanished. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. There was no way he could have gotten out without me hearing. The sound of the rain and the heavy truck door would have made noise. I climbed back into the truck, confused, and that's when I noticed something on the seat where he'd been sitting. A bloody bandage, left behind, and a crumpled newspaper tucked into the corner of the seat. I carefully picked up the newspaper, my heart pounding. It was an old page, torn and yellowed at the edges, with a headline that froze me in place. "Wanted for brutal homicide." There was a small, grainy photo next to the headline, and my blood ran cold. The face in the picture. It was him. Those sunken eyes, that vacant expression. It was Zach, the guy I'd just picked up on the side of the road. My mind started racing. Why was he in my truck? What did he want? And the most chilling question of all, where had he gone? I sat there, frozen, clutching that newspaper like it was some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The storm outside was getting even louder, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing. I kept thinking about the heavy backpack, the bloody bandage, the way he dodged every question. It all made sense now, but at the same time, it felt impossible. I glanced back at the seat, at the bloody strip of fabric he'd left behind. Was it his blood or someone else's? That thought made my stomach churn. I grabbed my phone, thinking about calling the police, but my hands were shaking so much I almost dropped it. Before I could make the call, something caught my eye. On the passenger side window, there were prints, fingerprints, pressed against the glass from the inside. It didn't make sense. I knew he wasn't there anymore, but the prints looked fresh. My heart started racing, and I felt that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I opened the truck door almost on instinct and jumped out, the rain pelting my face as I stood there. I took a quick lap around the truck, shining my phone's flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty road and the cold, biting wind cutting through me. I got back in the truck, trying to convince myself he'd just slipped away while I wasn't paying attention. Maybe someone else had picked him up. But then I saw it. On the driver's side mirror, there was writing. Someone had traced 2 words into the fogged-up glass. "Don't look." My entire body froze. I scanned the area again, expecting something, anything, and to jump out of the shadows, but all I saw was the empty highway, lit up by the occasional flash of lightning. I tried to swallow my fear and started the truck. I had to get out of there. As I drove off, I couldn't stop glancing at the side mirror, half expecting to see something staring back at me. The words were still there, faint but visible, like a ghostly reminder. I drove for about 10 minutes before realizing my chest felt tight and my hands were gripping the wheel so hard they ached. I pulled into a rest area, needing to calm down. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, and then I looked at the newspaper again. I hadn't paid attention to the date earlier, but now I did. It was from 1998, more than 20 years ago. I stared at the date, trying to make sense of it. How could he be the man in the photo? He looked too young, like someone around my age, but if the story was real, he should have been dead or locked up decades ago. My chest tightened. None of it made sense. I opened the newspaper again and noticed more details in the article. It mentioned that the man, identified as Zachary H., had escaped from prison after being convicted of a brutal murder in a small nearby town. The part that chilled me the most? He was last seen hitchhiking on a highway during a storm, exactly like that night. The rain started to let up, but the feeling that someone was watching me hadn't gone away. I decided I'd spent enough time at the rest area. I started the truck again, ready to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever had just happened. As I drove, the road felt emptier than ever, and every shadow seemed to move just a little too much. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something in the rearview mirror. For a split second, there was a dark figure standing at the edge of the road, watching me. My heart jumped, and I swerved slightly. When I looked again, it was gone. The next few hours were some of the longest of my life. Even with the radio on, trying to drown out the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every sound, every flash of lightning outside the window made my pulse race. When I finally reached the next town, I parked the truck and went straight to the front desk of a cheap motel. I just needed a bed, some lights on, and a little bit of peace. As I was filling out the check-in form, the clerk looked at me with a puzzled expression. "You okay, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost." I let out a nervous laugh, but didn't respond. I went up to my room, locked the door, and pushed a chair against it for good measure. Only then did I realize I was still holding the crumpled newspaper. I tried to sleep, but the silence in the room made my mind race even more. I kept thinking about Zach, the bloody bandage, the writing on the mirror. What did he want? Why did he choose me? To this day, I don't have any answers. All I know is that I'll never stop for a hitchhiker again. Maybe I crossed paths with something I was never meant to see, or maybe, just maybe, I gave a ride to someone who's no longer of this world. I've never been easily scared, but that day, That day is burned into my memory as something I still can't explain. My name is Mark, and I've been a truck driver for almost a decade, traveling roads most people wouldn't dare to cross. It was just a regular Wednesday in early spring, and I was hauling a massive piece of farming equipment to a rural property. Nothing out of the ordinary for me. But on that trip, things went wrong in a way that still gives me chills when I think about it. The road stretched endlessly, flanked by open fields and silos as far as the eye could see. My GPS, an old model that sometimes gave me trouble, suggested a shortcut. I should have known better than to trust those so-called faster routes, but I was in a hurry, so I took it. The road narrowed the farther I went, becoming more isolated with every mile. All I saw were wooden fences, rusty posts, and an eerie silence broken only by the hum of my truck's engine. When my radio lost its signal, I started feeling a creeping unease, but I brushed it off. The engine started acting up not long after. At first, it sputtered, then died completely, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I tried restarting the truck several times, but the engine wouldn't budge. I got out, standing by the roadside, staring at the empty stretch ahead. No cars, no houses, just the sound of the wind sweeping through the fields. Then, in the distance, I noticed a structure partially hidden by bare, twisted trees. It was an old farmhouse, the kind you see in horror movies. With no other options, I decided to head there. I grabbed my flashlight, it was getting dark, and walked down the dirt path leading to the house. As I got closer, the building's state became clear: broken windows, peeling paint, and a sagging roof. But one thing stood out immediately. The front door was slightly ajar, and there was light inside. It wasn't bright, more like the faint glow of an old bulb hanging from the ceiling. It had to mean someone was home, or so I thought. I knocked on the door, trying to be polite, but it creaked open a little further with the impact. "Hello? Is anyone here?" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The silence that followed was so heavy, it was almost suffocating. I stepped inside cautiously. The air was thick, with the smell of old wood mixed with something I couldn't place, something sour and metallic. The floor creaked under my boots, each step sounding far too loud in the quiet. Despite the house's abandoned look, certain details didn't make sense. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink, a rusted kettle sat on the stove, and a jacket was draped over a chair, as if someone had just stepped out. I moved slowly through the house, trying not to intrude too much, but curiosity kept pulling me deeper. The living room had a cold, dead fireplace filled with fresh ashes and a couch so worn it looked like it would collapse under any weight. On a small coffee table, there was a framed photograph. In the dim light, I could make out a couple smiling at the camera, dressed in clothing that seemed decades old, maybe from the 60s. Something about their eyes unsettled me. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was like they were staring directly at me, even from the photo. I placed the frame back down and decided it was time to leave. That's when I heard it. A strange sound, muffled and distant, coming from outside, like something heavy being dragged across the dirt. My heart started racing. I rushed to the door to see where the noise was coming from, but the darkness outside seemed even thicker than before. The only thing visible was the outline of a barn further back, its doors slightly ajar. The sound was coming from there, I was sure of it. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but there was something deliberate in the rhythm of the noise. It was like it wanted to draw me in, to lure me closer. Against all better judgment, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the barn, the cold wind biting at my face. My whole body was tense, every muscle screaming at me to turn back and leave. But curiosity, or maybe the need to understand what was happening, kept me moving forward. As I approached the barn, the sound stopped. I pushed the doors open, their creak echoing into the night. The smell inside was worse than the house, rotting flesh mixed with something chemical that made my stomach turn. My flashlight shook in my hand as I scanned the space. That's when I saw the marks on the ground. Deep grooves, as if something massive had been dragged from there toward the back of the barn. I followed the marks on the floor, taking slow, cautious steps. The sound of my boots echoed in the empty barn. My flashlight lit up walls covered in cobwebs and rusty tools hanging on crooked nails. The farther I went, the worse the smell became. A nauseating mix of decayed meat and something sharp and chemical that made my head spin. At the back of the barn, near a pile of hay that looked untouched for years, the marks abruptly ended, as if whatever had been dragged there had vanished into thin air. That's when I felt it. A chill ran down my spine, a primal instinct screaming at me that I wasn't alone anymore. I spun around, shining my flashlight behind me, but there was nothing there, just empty space. Then I heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, coming from above me, like something moving along the beams of the barn. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it upward, and that's when I saw it. For a split second, I swear I saw something move. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I'd ever seen. It was big, its limbs awkward and unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking or moving. And its eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They were too large, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like small, glowing mirrors, staring directly at me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just ran. I bolted out of the barn so fast I almost tripped over the threshold. The sound of my footsteps pounded in my ears, and I could swear I heard something chasing me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like claws scraping against wood, and then dirt. By the time I reached my truck, I was out of breath, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped the keys. My only thought was to get the engine running and leave as fast as possible, but the truck wouldn't start. It was like it had completely given up on me. That's when I saw it through the rearview mirror. The flashlight I had dropped near the barn was still on, casting a beam of light toward the path. And in that light, for just a moment, I saw it. Tall, awkward, with limbs so long they seemed impossible. It stood there, motionless, watching me. Then, without warning, it stepped back into the darkness, disappearing as if it had never been there. The silence returned, but I knew it was still out there. Somehow, the truck roared to life at that moment, the engine's noise making me jump. I didn't wait to find out anything else. I slammed on the gas and sped down the road, not daring to look back. As I drove down the dark, empty road, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. My hands were trembling on the wheel, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see that thing following me. But nothing appeared. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the silence inside the truck was as suffocating as the air in that barn. Finally, in the distance, I spotted a gas station, a small island of light in the endless void. I pulled in and climbed out of the truck without a second thought. I needed light, people, anything to remind me that the normal world still existed. The attendant gave me a strange look as I walked into the convenience store, covered in dust and clearly shaken. I asked for a strong coffee and stood there for a while, trying to catch my breath. After a few minutes, I decided to ask him about the road and that farmhouse. He frowned and shook his head. "You took the shortcut? No one uses that road anymore. That place, you're better off not messing with it," he said, his voice low but serious. I tried to press for details, but he just changed the subject and told me to move on and forget about it. The next morning, after finally delivering the equipment, I tried looking up information about the farmhouse. I didn't find much, just old stories about a family that had lived there in the 1960s. Apparently, they had vanished without a trace, and the property had been abandoned ever since. Some people claimed to hear strange noises coming from the barn or see lights in the house, but no one seemed to know what had really happened. The more I read, the colder I felt. Everything lined up with what I had experienced, but no one had any answers. It was as if that place existed outside of what we could understand. To this day, I don't know what that thing was or why it was there. All I know is that I'll never trust a GPS shortcut again. Every time I drive through rural areas, I feel my chest tighten, half expecting to see those glowing eyes again. Maybe I'll never figure out what happened that night, but one thing is for sure. Whatever was in that farmhouse, I wasn't welcome there, and I never want to go back. I've never been a fan of driving long distances at night, but back then, I didn't have much of a choice. It was early March and I was coming back from a work trip in the countryside. My home was about 5 hours away, and it was close to midnight when the exhaustion really hit me. My eyes were burning, and I knew that if I didn't pull over for some rest, I might fall asleep at the wheel. That's when I saw a glowing sign for a rest stop a few miles ahead. I figured it was better to take a quick nap and continue driving safely. The place was deserted. A single flickering fluorescent light illuminated the parking lot, casting shadows that seemed to move with the wind. I parked my truck in one of the spots closest to the bathroom entrance and turned off the engine. Everything around me felt eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of the light and the distant buzz of insects. Before reclining my seat to nap, I noticed the bathroom was about 20 yards away, its door swinging slowly. It seemed odd that it was open at this hour, but I didn't give it much thought. I fell asleep the moment I laid back. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up with an unsettling feeling like something was off. My mouth was dry, and the first thing I noticed was the stronger wind outside, rustling the tree branches and making the bathroom door creak annoyingly as it swung. That's when I glanced out my window and saw it. Footprints. They were muddy boot prints, starting right next to my driver's side door and leading toward the bathroom. I froze for a second, trying to process what I was seeing. I was sure the parking lot was dry. There hadn't been any rain for days, and those footprints definitely hadn't been there when I parked. My heart started pounding as I traced the path with my eyes. The prints stopped right at the bathroom door, which was now swaying with a low, rhythmic creak. My mind was racing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another traveler had stopped while I was asleep. But why would someone walk around my truck, and why did the footprints stop at the bathroom? I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Still, I locked the truck doors before stepping out to investigate. Yes, I know it sounds stupid, but my curiosity got the better of me at that moment. The cold night air hit me as soon as I got out. The silence outside was even more unsettling, like the whole world was holding its breath. I walked slowly toward the footprints, my eyes fixed on the ground. The prints were large, likely from heavy boots, and each step seemed to have been taken with force, as if the person had been in a hurry or carrying something heavy. The flickering light overhead made everything feel surreal, like I was trapped in a scene from a horror movie. When I reached the bathroom entrance, I stopped. The door was still swaying, creaking softly, and the smell inside was awful, a mix of mildew and something I couldn't quite place. I called out hesitantly, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" My voice sounded strange, echoing off the tiled walls. No one answered. I waited a moment, hearing only the sound of the door swinging and the distant wind. Then I decided to go in. The place was completely empty. 2 rusty sinks, a cracked mirror, and 3 stalls, all with their doors open. I walked in cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. The floor was dry. There were no muddy footprints, no sign of whoever had left those prints outside. I started to feel like I was being watched, as if someone was hiding there with me, holding their breath. I decided to check the stalls one by one, even though I had a bad feeling about it. I pushed the first door gently. Nothing, just a dirty toilet and a piece of toilet paper stuck to the wall. The second stall was the same. When I got to the third stall, I hesitated for a moment. The silence in there felt strange, heavier, as if the entire place was warning me to turn back. But again, curiosity won over common sense. I swung the door open quickly, almost expecting to find someone, or something. But there was nothing there, at least nothing visible. Still, the air inside the stall felt different, denser, with a faint metallic smell that made my throat tighten for a moment. I swallowed hard and stepped back. Something about the whole situation was deeply wrong, and for the first time, I started seriously questioning why I hadn't just driven away. As I exited the bathroom, a loud sound froze me in place. It was the distinct noise of something falling to the ground, coming from outside. My mind raced for answers. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe an animal had knocked something over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. Slowly, I peeked out the bathroom door and looked toward my truck. The tailgate was open. I was absolutely certain I had closed it before lying down to sleep. I walked cautiously toward the truck, every muscle in my body tense. When I got close enough to see inside the bed of the truck, my heart nearly stopped. Lying in the middle of it was a boot, one of those thick rubber boots caked in mud, as if it had been placed there on purpose. My eyes stayed locked on the boot for a few seconds, while my brain scrambled to find a logical explanation. Who could have put it there? And more importantly, how did they do it without me hearing a thing? A chill ran down my spine, and I looked around, feeling more vulnerable than ever. The wind was still blowing, rustling the trees in the distance, but now it felt like something else was out there, a presence. A surge of panic hit me, and I climbed back into the truck, locking the doors again. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 2 tries to turn the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. But just as I was about to drive off, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. At the entrance to the bathroom, the door was no longer just swaying in the wind. It was wide open now, and for a brief moment, I swear I saw a figure standing there, tall, thin, and completely still, as if watching me. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the fear had already settled deep in my chest. Without thinking twice, I hit the gas and sped out of the rest stop. The wind howled, and my heart was pounding as loud as the engine. I didn't allow myself to relax until I'd driven a few miles down the road, but even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. I didn't see anything until I got home. When I parked in my driveway, a wave of relief washed over me. I stepped out of the truck, grabbed my backpack from the bed, and headed inside. It wasn't until I was locking the door behind me that I noticed something strange. There was a muddy handprint on my backpack, as if someone had grabbed it. My stomach turned. It didn't make any sense. I was sure no one had touched my backpack, and it had been sitting in the truck bed the entire time. I dropped it on the floor and opened it quickly, searching through the contents. Everything seemed normal: my clothes, my phone charger, some paperwork. But at the very bottom, I found something that definitely didn't belong to me. A piece of paper, folded and covered in mud, with a strong, earthy smell. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The message, scrawled in shaky, smudged handwriting, made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have stopped." My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. Who could have put that there? And what did they mean? The unsettling feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever, as if I wasn't alone in my own home. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to explain what had happened as clearly as I could. Of course, they chalked it up to some kind of prank and told me there wasn't much they could do, but they promised to send a patrol to check out the rest stop that night. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from a simple joke. Hoping to calm down, I decided to take a shower, but even under the running water, my mind kept replaying the footprints, the boot in the truck, and the note. After the shower, I returned to the living room and noticed something that made my heart nearly stop. My backpack, which I had left by the door, was now in the middle of the room. I hadn't touched it since I dropped it. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The only thing I could do was grab a baseball bat from the closet, lock myself in the bedroom, and sit on the bed, listening to what sounded like faint footsteps outside my door.